Dr. Francis Edwards was a doctor and alienist who contributed this story to an anthology of true ghost experiences early last century. Dr. Edwards was for some time the medical superintendent at Camberwell House, a London mental health asylum. He would often talk to an elderly man by the name of Mr. Rowe, who regularly visited one of his patients. On one occasion, this man asked Edwards if he believed in ghosts, to which he answered, of course, it was impossible to deny their existence. Rowe claimed to have witnessed an extraordinary supernatural phenomenon in his own home, which he had written down, although never revealing his experience to anyone. He was particularly concerned about being laughed at, and so had documented the occurrences in painstaking detail as if to verify their truthfulness. He later sent Edwards a 200-page manuscript of his family's experience. Rowe's family had lived in a now old terrace house in Bath, England, for generations. However, as a young man, he had possessed a restless soul and spirit of adventure. This had seen him heading for Australia during the gold rush of 1850. In Australia, Rowe married and raised a family, while, in the meantime, his own father passed away and left him the family home in Bath. Not wanting to return, Rowe asked his lawyer to ensure that the house was kept in good order and a responsible caretaker placed in charge. One of Rowe's sons later passed away, with the young man's wife surviving him by only a year, leaving his then 7-year-old granddaughter Mary an orphan. Rowe then became a guardian of the girl, whom he was at pains to describe as a happy little person and perfectly normal child. He found himself devoted to Mary, who he decided would benefit from an English upbringing. Fortunately, his house in Bath was well ready to step back into, and the rest of his children independent and leading their own lives. So Rowe and his granddaughter Mary made their journey back to the mother country. Mary loved her new home in Bath, where she would often spend time in the garden and play with her dolls in the library every evening. One night, after several months, when she and her grandfather were sitting in the library together, she asked him whoever was the old gentleman sitting in the big chair with ears. She described the man she saw as being oddly dressed, to which Mr. Rowe told her that there was no one there at all. Mary insisted, saying that the man had just nodded his head and she believed that he knew her. She remarked that she hadn't even seen him come into the room. Changing the subject, Rowe asked Mary to check on the mail, and when she returned, she commented that the old man was no longer there. However, the visitor kept returning, and Mary described his appearance in such minute detail that Rowe became reluctantly convinced that the apparition was his own father. The man had continued to wear clothes fashionable in the early 19th century, refusing to update his wardrobe over time. However, Rowe did not want his granddaughter to think that her friend was a ghost, and so hoped that the situation would eventually normalise. He could not think why his father would come back to haunt his former library, or why he wanted to get in touch with Mary. As the weeks went by, Mary and her invisible great-grandfather carried on long conversations, which he reported back to Rowe, as he was never able to see or hear the apparition. Rowe would ask Mary to question her great-grandfather about family matters known only to himself and the deceased spirit, whose answers largely dispelled any doubt about the presence actually being him. However, one day Rowe posed a question that completely convinced him. He suggested to Mary that she ask her great-grandpapa what happens to babies who pass away before they have even opened their eyes. Mary addressed the unseen occupant of the big chair with ears, then paused for a few minutes as he seemingly answered. She finally whispered that great-grandpapa had told her that stillborn children go on living in heaven, but she asked, what does stillborn mean? Rowe explained the meaning of the word, and from then on was convinced of his father's presence and connection with Mary. This was because he knew that the small girl had never before heard the word stillborn. He was now convinced that the ghostly conversations were real. The seasons passed, and Mary's first English spring arrived when she was to report a conversation that shocked Rowe. She related that her great-grandpapa had told her that he would not be visiting the house anymore because she was soon going to live with him. Rowe's heart stood still as he understood his father's meaning only too well. Mary had unknowingly received her summons to another world. Her great-grandfather never appeared again, and within a month she had followed him to the other side. Why, we are not told, but there were still many childhood illnesses during that time. While Rowe's account of these events had been mislaid by Dr. Edwards, one detail really stood out to him. Mary's great-grandfather had told her that he had visited Australia, and he had described to her her father's and grandfather's houses in Adelaide, Australia. As he had never during his lifetime left England, these revelations were seen as extraordinary by Rowe. It certainly does seem like this kindly ghost befriended his great-granddaughter in order to soften the passage of her soul's impending migration.